Welcome again to one of our sessions at Juris North. This is one of our monthly discussions. Today we will have our professor from London, Professor Eric Heinze from the School of Law, Queen Mary, University of London, talking about critical legal theory. And then we will have the pleasure, one of our co-hosts and chairs for Juris North, Dr. Ian Turner, reader in Human Rights and Security from the School of Law, University of Central Lancashire. We will have his input about Eric's talk. We have people who are joining us for the first time. What we do at Juris North, we follow a sort of Rawlsian tradition or methodology. We will have today one expert, Eric, our pleasure, and the rest of us, simply people interested in learning from each other. We don't have professors or students, simply people willing to ask questions we may have to Eric in this case. Eric, my pleasure to have you here. We met many years ago. So my pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us and for playing the game. And this is your floor.
Well, thank you, Jorge. It's lovely to see you again. And thank you to each of you for coming, and of course to Ian for being willing to chair. What I'll do is I'll just upload a PowerPoint, which I hope will genuinely perform the service of a PowerPoint and make things easy to follow. There we go. Okay. Whoops. There we go. Okay. Does everyone see the PowerPoint clearly?
Yeah, perfectly well.
That's good. All right then. Jorge, could you just remind me for how much time you wanted me to speak?
This is your floor. From experience, we have anything and everything from 20 minutes to 40 minutes.
Okay.
So this is your floor. We are here to listen to you.
Very good. All right. No, that's fine. I'll try to keep within that. All right. Lovely. Well, I mean, I guess I'm aware that the way I present this topic simply in its title, without anything further, already probably produces a bit of puzzlement, because when you say critical theory or critical legal theory, I think some of you who are familiar with critical theory will know that this covers so many areas, so many problems, people coming from so many different disciplines, often in great disagreement with each other, or simply working on very different sorts of things, that it's legitimate to ask whether one could generalize at all about critical theory, much less to try to do so in a way which tracks a particular direction or predicts or recommends one. And so what I'm going to try to do today, I'm not going to try any kind of essentialism. I'm not going to try to suggest that critical legal theory can only be one thing, has only been one thing, ought to only be one thing. This is not my intention at all. It's rather, I'd like to simply look at a few elements which I think have recurred, which maybe are not always present in every bit of research that people might identify as critical theory, but nevertheless, which might form a kind of center of gravity, a kind of set of themes which seem to reemerge, seem to often dominate in the field, or to have been very influential in the field. And I'm going to select those elements in particular because as I proceed, first I'm just going to try to lay some elements on the table, and then I'm going to try to work with them a bit to see if there are some problems, some deficits, some things that I think critical theory as a whole seems to be neglecting. So that's kind of the overall strategy. And so in order to give a name to just some of these possibly unifying elements, these common threads, and for lack of anything better, I'm going to call it the radical critique of Western liberal democracy. And of course, this is not much of a narrowing. This could mean many things. So let me just kind of jump in with two elements. The first element would be roughly as follows: a kind of what I would call a kind of working tenet, which has been common, I think, in a lot of critical theory, namely, beginning with early modernity and continuing into the present, Western societies have cumulatively damaged millions of lives at home and abroad through economic exploitation, militarism, colonialism, racism, and other forms of injustice, often on a global scale. Incidentally, I often throw into that list things like patriarchy, heteronormativity. Of course, these have also been very important elements within critical theory. And then a second qualifier to that statement: admittedly, some injustices of these types arise at other points in history and beyond the West's borders. However, their Western manifestations have proved to be systemic, pervasive, exceptionally destructive, and moreover, institutionally justified through post-Enlightenment norms of justice. So this is just some attempt to capture what I think have been recurring or often unifying themes running throughout a lot of critical theory. I don't want to make any lesser, but also no greater claim. And I'll be happy to return to the slide if anybody wants to pick apart any of these threads. But for now, I'll move on. If you're willing kind of to accept this as a working description of what some or much of critical theory has been doing, then I would argue that a number of points flow from this. Again, I think some of which will be familiar to you, even if I'm using maybe what will not necessarily be a familiar vocabulary. I think the core ideas will be familiar. Some of them have already kind of influenced areas well beyond critical theory. So some facets then of what I'm calling this radical critique of Western liberal democracy. The first I would refer to as counterformalism. This is just another way of describing the well-known critique of formalism within critical theory as a way of critically approaching the function, the role of law. Now, of course, this famously goes back to Karl Marx, right, who famously depicted, in particular, sort of classical liberal norms, right, in his famous writing on the Jewish question or on the Gotha program, who presented Enlightenment era or classical liberal norms of equal citizenship, of human dignity, of individual freedom, of the rule of law, right? He presented all of these famously as superstructure, Überbau, as more as tools to entrench the interests of the dominant capitalist class, right, with a kind of illusion of universality, with a kind of empty pledge of universality, but which in practice simply becomes an overlaying ideology to preserve hierarchies of wealth, of power, and so forth. Right, so part of this critique of formalism then consists in a critique of the universalist and hegemonic discourses of classical liberalism, right? Universalist in the sense that these ideals of freedom, equality, and so forth are presented as accessible to all people within a society, or indeed to all people around the world, depending on what kind of 19th century liberal you are. And these discourses, again, are presented, right, as Gramsci would later point out, as hegemonic, right? In other words, they really just represent the interests of a privileged class, but are presented in a universalist form so that the oppressor buys into his or her own oppression, right? The oppressor adopts the ethos, right, of the dominant discourse, a discourse also including freedom, equality, rule of law, and so forth, also of meritocracy, right? So that if one is poor, one deserves to be poor, and the poor themselves buy into this, right? I think all of this has been part of the critique of formalism. Which, of course, right, as Marx sets it out, is very much a critique of classical liberalism. So this is very much a foundation of what I'm calling the radical critique of Western liberal democracy. Now, I call this counter-formalism and not anti-formalism. And what I mean by this is that I don't think it would be easy to find. I think there are some critical theorists who have flirted with the idea, particularly in the 1970s, of law without formalisms. But I'm not sure anybody would ever really believe this, that any kind of legal system, and certainly in anything that we call a kind of post-industrial society, could ever work without formalism. So the way I would look at the critique of formalism today is not that we just get rid of all formalisms. That would almost mean getting rid of legal language altogether. Legal language works through formalisms. So insofar it is linguistic, it is formalist. But never so that's why I don't call the critique of formalism anti-formalist, but counter-formalist, right? In other words, while perhaps conceding that formalism is inherent to law, nevertheless, the critique remains ongoing of the ways in which dominant discourses, in particular classical liberal discourses, can be manipulated to bring about a reality which is in many ways the arch opposite of what is promised. A second facet, which I would call counter-subjectivism. And what I mean by this is I would cast, I think, the bulk of what we have long been calling critical theory as post-Kantian, or maybe more particularly post-Hegelian. In other words, I think a common thread running through much critical theory is that we cannot evaluate, we cannot assess any kind of significant legal or political action according to the declared intentions of the lawmakers or the political actors, right? Of course, you could say a kind of classical Kantian, a classical liberal ethics was very much focused on the intention of the subject, right? Of course, again, Kant here is the point of reference because Kant, you might say, is the ultimate or extreme example of the idea that ethics depend solely on the intention of the actor. Or at least, if not solely, in the first instance, on the ethics or on the or the intentions of the individual actor. And of course, I think this is central to Hegel's critique of Kant, and then to Marx's, and then to a whole line, right? Which you know very much heralds the era of sociology, even if we can't quite call Hegel a sociologist or even Marx, but nevertheless, what kind of really starts to mark the 19th century is the idea that if we want to politically evaluate important legal or political action or policy, we have to do so in terms of processes, in terms of broader forces that are acting together, often interacting, right? And that we have to see, we can only really assess individual action as part of larger trends, larger patterns, larger systems of power, right? Indeed, which brings us right from Hegel right up to someone like Michel Foucault. And so I think it's this and here again, I don't say anti-subjectivist. I don't want to go to the extreme that either Hegel or Marx or Foucault or any anyone who has been influential within critical theory. I don't want to go to the extreme of saying that this post-Hegelian trend entirely annihilates the individual, entirely negates individual intention, so much as that it figures individual intention, individual action, always within broader processes. And so I call it not anti-subjectivist, but counter-subjectivist. And I think this gives us more familiar notions, such as notions of unconscious bias or systemic or institutional repression or discrimination or exclusion, right? Of course, the Macpherson report here in Britain is still a benchmark in terms of a kind of broader institutional recognition that individual actors can act with benign intentions, right? This was when I say Macpherson, this was the famous Stephen Lawrence inquiry into the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, right? And so Macpherson kind of brought critical theory sort of right into the House of Parliament, you might say, right? By ascertaining that you could have individual actors who did not think that they were racist, who neither on their own self-understanding or on any evidence were acting with conscious racist motives, and yet in a systemic and institutional way brought about systemically racist circumstances. So I would call all of this part of the counter-subjectivism of critical theory. A third, or of the radical critique of Western liberal democracy. A third element, which I think will not come as a surprise at all, and which you'll notice I'm typefacing here a bit differently, just to signal a curiosity. The element here is, as I'm referring to, as counter-utilitarianism, and I'm kind of earmarking this element because I would not call it altogether a kind of frontal critique of Western liberal democracy, because leading classical liberal and contemporary liberal figures have always also somehow distanced themselves from utilitarianism. Kant does it, Mill does it, Rawls does it. They all do. They all are really concerned about utilitarianism, and they really talk about it. Well, of course, in Kant's time, the term didn't exist yet, but he's talking about instrumentalist forms of reasoning all the time in order to set up his deontological ethics in contradistinction. And of course, Mill's famous tract on utilitarianism is actually pulling away from the kind of mechanical utilitarianism of Bentham and, of course, of his own father, James Mill. Rawls, too, of course, right, is very, very intent on defining his project as, as not rejecting utilitarianism, but taking a certain distance from it. Now, this I actually see very much carried over into critical theory. And so here, here it's a critique of things that go on in liberal democracies more than a critique of any kind of hard and fast utilitarianism within the classical liberal tradition. But nevertheless, I think it is very much part of critical reasoning as well as liberal, and crits will not necessarily draw the same conclusions in their anti or counter-utilitarianism as liberals might do. So what might be some aspects of counter-utilitarianism? A caveat, and again, why I say counter and not anti, is that for both classical liberals and for critical theorists, I don't think anybody seriously thinks that you can entirely eliminate utilitarian balancing. No serious liberal, neither Kant nor Mill nor Rawls, none of them ever argue this, right? The kind of distance they take from utilitarianism is far more nuanced, and by no means do they say that we can completely eliminate utilitarian balancing, which is almost common sense, nor do I know of any critical theorist who would seriously maintain this, for the simple reason that in the kind of everyday business of politics, say balancing a budget, how much money do we spend on education, how much on healthcare, and so much, right? We're always doing balancing, right? We're always doing a kind of utilitarian balancing at best, actually, right? If it's not just a kind of corrupt horse trading, right? Sometimes it's altogether desirable that we're doing utilitarian balancing. Nevertheless, one of the main reasons why I think both liberals and crits cannot simply reduce their projects to utilitarianism, right, is because of the problem of what we could call mass injustice in particular. Mass injustices, which we can also simply call atrocities. Once injustice reaches a certain pitch, a certain level, the first thing to say about it is that it becomes difficult to talk about in quantified terms, right? In other words, I don't know, would a Holocaust of 5 million people have been better than one of 6 million, right? We get into really strange sorts of reasoning that I think both liberals and crits rightly avoid as a kind of a kind of perversion of utilitarianism. And so I think the problem of mass injustice, well, there are other problems with utilitarian balancing, but I'm going to focus now on the problem of mass injustice, which not only starts to become very difficult to talk about in quantified terms, but also when we're talking about mass injustices, they become incommensurable. That's kind of a consequence of being unquantifiable, right? In other words, once again, every now and then discussions pop up about, well, was the Holocaust worse than the transatlantic slave trade, or was that worse than, millennia of subordination of women, right? And at some point, I think what's common to both traditions, at least at their best, right, is that in sense these are just non-questions. These are things that cannot be compared, at least not in any. I mean, we can draw topological comparisons. What were the techniques? What were the methods? Those kind of comparisons can be informative and enlightening. But in terms of drawing sort of final, sort of a kind of drawing up a balance sheet, a kind of a score sheet of atrocities, I think both traditions very much distance themselves from this. In other words, mass injustices cannot be offset, and also cannot be offset through any compensating gains, right? And again, I think what would be clear for crits, but also I think for, within much of the liberal tradition, is that if we're talking about something like, centuries or millennia of patriarchy, or centuries of transatlantic slave trade, or whatever the atrocity may be, right, that it's it's rarely a creditable argument to say, well, but look at the benefits, look at the upsides, right? If you're to look at the trade state and say, well, but look at, cotton production, became very competitive, that just somehow sends shivers down our spine. This is just a kind of cost-benefit assessment that I think certainly critical theorists would never be willing to make. At least I've never seen any willing to make it. And I think even in classical liberalism becomes at least a theoretical problem. Even if many crits would accuse classical liberals of de facto having tolerated untenable utilitarian calculations. And then finally, a fourth element, which I would refer to as a counter-apologetics. Counter-apologetics. In other words, again, if we're looking at some atrocities that have been characteristic within Western liberal democracies, such as the transatlantic slave trade, such as patriarchy, such as heteronormativity, such as exploitation of labor, and I'm sure I don't have to, and military adventures, I'm sure I don't really need to dwell on the particular atrocities. You're probably very familiar with them. I think another kind of argument that critical theory inevitably rejects would be, the idea that well, these were just kind of errors or aberrations. This is not really right. If we look back at the last 2 or 3 centuries, this was not the best of liberalism, or this was not the best of democracy, right? In other words, this is just another way of going back to counterformalism. In other words, if I'm giving an account of democracy, I think for critical theory, it is untenable It is untenable for me to say, well, we have, freedom for all, equality for all, rule of law for all, dignity for all, meritocracy for all, although there have been mistakes in the past, right? I think for critical theory, the point of casting mass injustice at the center is to emphasize, again, that it is systemic. It has been pervasive, systemic, structural within Western liberal democracy. Indeed, I think many, within post-colonial theory and so forth, would argue that Western liberal democracies, would go so far as to say that Western liberal democracies existed only through certain sources of mass injustice. And so when I say counter-apologetics rejects the idea of a purity narrative, right? It's really just the same thing as saying it rejects the idea of simply reducing liberal democracy to its declared ideals, to its self-proclaimed ideals, right? To its idealized version. In other words, we can only understand liberal democracy by looking at its realities, and not by trying to reduce it, to collapse it into its high-minded ideals, right? In other words, we cannot tell an apologetic story. We cannot tell an apologetic story, right? And here I was wavering. Maybe I should have just said that it is anti-apologetic. That's a bit more of a nuance, but I'm not going to dwell too much on that. That would be a bit of hair splitting. Here, maybe I just wanted a bit of linguistic continuity. And at any rate, I don't want to suggest that critical theorists would never allow any leeway or would never take seriously some of the formalisms of liberal democracy. So just as to give myself a bit of breathing space, a bit of flexibility, I just call this a counter-apologetics, right? A skepticism about a purity narrative, about a purely formalistic presentation of liberal democracy on its own idealized terms. And this brings us to, I guess, a final component that I'm just kind of want to lay out in this preliminary way before I go on to kind of pulling some of this apart. I think what also flows from this notion of counterformalism, which leads to counter-apologetics, is that even if critical theorists cannot agree on anything else, even if we were to assemble a room of 25 or 50 critical theorists, only to find that they couldn't agree on anything, that they were fighting about everything, that they couldn't unify around any kind of platform, which might very well happen. I do think there is actually agreement, surely, on one kind of programmatic element, and I don't think it will come as a surprise. It's an educational element, which gets back to a point that Peter made when we were all saying hello to each other. In other words, the idea of memory politics. Memory politics, in other words, two steps are involved. First, of course, it is important to record historical memory, to preserve historical memory, to document mass injustice, but that's not enough. In other words, it's not enough that this is simply a seminar room exercise, a classroom exercise, an academic or scholarly enterprise. I think there's a long tradition of critical theory, again going back to Marx's famous 11th Feuerbach thesis, right? Which is that it's not enough simply to interpret the world, the point is to change it, right? And so this is why I talk not only about historical memory, about recording and discussing in the classroom, but about memory politics, about a certain mission to educate the public, that the public, that if we want things to change, fine, we might disagree on a million platform or policy points, right? But the one thing we surely agree on is the necessity of an engaged memory politics, of a proactive one, where we actively go out and educate the public, right, about the historical injustices of Western liberal democracies. Okay, moving on. with these four facets of the radical critique in mind, I'm going to introduce one more facet. But this is where I'm going to suggest some problems begin to creep in when we put all of this together. And that fifth facet I'm going to refer to as collective self-reflection. I think many critical theorists would be rather proud of a certain tradition of self-reflection within critical theory. Again, it's always been a current running throughout leftist thought since the 19th century. The Bolsheviks called it, criticism, self-criticism. Okay, that kind of went a bit pear-shaped, but nevertheless, I think the spirit of maintaining self-criticism has often been a point of pride, even a point of honor. Among many critical theorists. Just to name some examples, if we look at, again, the kind of heyday of 19th century leftism, Marxism and related currents, you could say the paradigm figure of oppression is the proletarian, often presented, particularly iconographically, well into the 20th century, indeed, as the kind of white worker, the white factory worker, maybe occasionally a white farm worker, but the kind of white factory worker, male, of course, the white male factory worker above all, as the kind of quintessential icon of the oppressed. And even again in the 19th and early 20th century, when we read people like Rosa Luxemburg and many others, and indeed Marx himself, right, when they certainly acknowledge problems of women's oppression, problems of racism, particularly with respect to the slave trade and so forth. So they acknowledge, they're certainly aware of what we today would call identitarian forms of oppression. But of course, for them, it's the status of these people as fundamentally working class, which is key. Right, which is key, right? As proletarian in the largest sense, of course. Right, it was never thought that the proletarian is only ever just an urban factory worker, right? But again, that's a kind of iconography. But as we know, the further we move into the 20th century, the more that iconography really begins to deteriorate, and the identitarian paradigm, which is a more multiple one, a more multifaceted one, starts to take center stage. And so then, so nowadays, the word proletarian is almost only kind of historical, and instead, we will still talk about workers clearly, but then we also talk about ethnic groups, about women, about sexual minorities, and so forth, right? And so we've gone from a kind of more universalist understanding of oppression to a more pluralist one. And again, I think many critical theorists would see this as a matter of pride, as the fact that they were never stuck in dogmas, that they were always willing to revise earlier mistakes, earlier errors. And we can come up with more examples. Another example within feminism or within queer theory, right? There again, we've often heard criticisms that earlier forms of feminism or of queer theory, were too focused on sort of white middle class Westerners, right? And as we've seen over time, and particularly in recent decades, that has also gone from a more unified to a more pluralistic sort of model, right? So I don't think we can doubt that really important forms of collective self-reflection have been part of critical theory. However, I would argue that this kind of self-reflection has worked best when the result that comes out of it, right? In other words, more identity politics, right? Or intersectionality, right? In other words, these moves from a singularity to a plurality. None of those moments of self-reflection ever jeopardized the radical or the critical project as such. In many ways, it just helped to keep advancing it. So where there's convergence with the ultimate aims of the radical critique, I think this collective self-reflection has worked very well, right? here's what the rest of my presentation is going to be. And I realize I realize that the clock is ticking, but I'll do my best. I'll do my best. I think where this element of collective self-reflection has broken down has been where there's divergence. In other words, where a rethinking, a recasting no longer necessarily bolsters the radical critique, but somehow seems to threaten it. Incidentally, what I should have said at the outset, apologies for the omission, is and I guess this will come as no surprise, this is part of kind of a current research project of mine. It's a book that I'm already commissioned to write, and I really need to hurry and finish up, as well as some articles. And so in order to explain my own criticism here, I'll tell you about three of the chapters which address points of breakdown, in my opinion. Points of divergence, in other words, where critical self-reflection, collective self-reflection kind of stops, kind of breaks down, because it no longer advances the radical critique. It seems to threaten that project. I'm not sure it really does threaten the project, but it seems to. It threatens to undermine the project. So what are those three? I'll put them down quickly. One is the Ukraine war. Another is free speech. You can see these are very topical and still hotly debated. Another is anti-Semitism. Okay, you could probably come up with more, but in the book and in this research project, I'm focusing on these three, right, as points where I think really critical theory has just kind of gone silent. Right. Of course, there's been endless debates. Anybody who can tolerate more than about 30 seconds more of Twitter a day, sees these, all over the place. These sorts of topics, and of course, we see left and right going at each other. Not only left against right, but also among the left and among the right. We see all the wars going on, right? Obviously, since I don't have a lot of time, I'm only going to sketch these quite thematically for the moment. And then when we go into discussion, I'll be happy to try to expand. Let me start with the Ukraine war. Now, of course, in the Ukraine war, it's just too early to tell, what might be a consensus among critical theorists, right? So far, my searches have not yielded enough. Right, we know some earlier, I think, for example, the Iraq war, we do have precedent, right? The Iraq war was an enormous stimulus, I think, to critical theorists, right? Because the Iraq war seemed to confirm so much of those elements I was just discussing on the previous slide. It really go right back to Marx about how all sorts of norms of, humanitarian norms and human rights norms, all of these great Enlightenment ideals are invoked, right, not in order to preserve peace or to preserve stability or to empower citizens, but just to wreck a society like Iraq. At least this was, a common theme, and indeed filled whole books. Now, of course, Ukraine is not quite Iraq, right? And the debates in the public sphere have not really been the same. As I said, it's too early to tell what might be critical theory, what kind of critical theory might emerge around the Ukraine war. Suffice it to say that people whose views have been very aligned with much of critical theory, of course, someone like Noam Chomsky immediately comes to mind, right, who's often cited in critical theory, or whose views often seem to reflect or to coincide. Of course, he's taken positions which I think actually betray a lack of self-reflection among critical theorists, or indeed more generally on a kind of intellectual or enlightened left. What is that lack? Well, you see, the problem is when we read people like the Stop the War Coalition or Noam Chomsky or Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France or Die Linke in Germany or any number of others, a constant theme is that they only tell the story They only recite a history which basically begins after the Cold War. Now, this is quite paradoxical. As we know, when critical theorists are studying racism, colonialism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, militarism, economic exploitation, usually, the studies go back centuries. And so I've been asking myself over the past year, why is it that these people whose views very much seem to be in alignment with much critical theory, people like Lindsay German, Noam Chomsky, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and many others, why is it that they're only talking about what happened after the Cold War? Why is history all of a sudden so narrow when critical theorists are always telling us to take very broad histories, and they're right? They're quite right to tell us. This is how I teach my students, right? Critical theories with long histories. Well, of course, the problem is that if you broaden the history, if you go back into the Cold War, then you have to deal with the Kremlin, you have to deal with Moscow, right? And we have a century of history of very problematical involvements of the left, right? And now, just to be clear, as we know, a lot of important critical theory, Hannah Arendt, Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, right? Some of these leading figures in critical theory were very critical of the Soviet Union, particularly of Stalinism, of totalitarianism, right? Right, and we can continue that. And yet, I don't think the problem is that critical theorists are ignoring or indeed are denying. That's what I should say. The problem is not that they deny these histories. They will often cite Arendt and Adorno and so forth. Excuse me. I think the problem is, and this is kind of my bottom line, this is my build-up, this is the drum roll. The problem is that they will recognize that historical memory, but it has never become a part of the memory politics of critical theory. It's never become part of the memory, and it's never become a part of the active engagement of we need to educate the world about this. It always just stays in the seminar room. It always just stays in the classroom. This is, I think, an enormous problem. I can see that I only have about a minute left. So I'm just going to very quickly, I realize I'm leaving out a lot here. But you see, but just a last comment on the Ukraine war is
don't rush it, Eric, if I may, because
yes.
we are following your presentation, so don't rush it.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. Well, but I do want to hear from. All right, so then okay, if that means that you're willing to give me another minute or two, then let me just say that. So what happens then with using the example of the Ukraine war is that oddly, and I think unfortunately, we end up with a purity narrative. We end up with a purity, and we end up with precisely the kind of narrative that you're not supposed to tell about Western liberal democracy. Right? You're not supposed to say about Western liberal democracy, it's freedom, it's equality, it's the rule of law, it's meritocracy, right? Because you're not supposed to revert to the ideals, to a kind of ideal. You're supposed to say, well, what has it been in reality, right? And so it's just not satisfying to say, oh, well, Soviet Union, that wasn't the real socialism, right? Yeah, we know this, right? But we're supposed to look at, well, what was the real socialism, in fact? Right, and so this is a real problem here. This is a real problem. Is that we tell these long histories about Western liberal democracy because we want to connect the dots. We want to say that, yes, racism today has its roots in 19th and 18th and 17th century racism and patriarchy and heteronormativity, right? It's an ongoing story. So the criticism I'm bringing is that I think too much, if only tacitly within critical theory, there's an acknowledgement of leftist abuses, but no dots connected. So what do? We open up Noam Chomsky on Ukraine, no dots connected from positions that he himself took maybe 50 or 40 or 30 years ago, right? And that much of the left had been taking. No dots connected. That's in the past. That's kind of sort of, airbrushed out. In other words, they won't deny it, but it's tightly consigned to the past. And this is a real problem. There's no connecting of dots of the type that is considered to be essential when we're doing the history of Western liberal democracy. Essentially, I would say the same thing about the anti-Semitism controversy. the exact same thing. There's not a denial of leftist anti-Semitism but it's always kept in the past. So we look at, yes, people like Bakunin and Keir Hardie and George Orwell, right? A couple of figures are named from long time ago who, yes, we have to admit, we have to acknowledge that they had anti-Semitic views, but those are never, there's no series of dots connected up to the kind that we see now, right? And so again, in the case of Western liberal democracy, we are not allowed to say that mass injustices, that they were errors and aberrations. We're supposed to see them as structural, as systemic, as pervasive, yet we're presented with anti-Semitism. It's only ever errors. It's not denied, but it's not the real leftism. It's not the real socialism. It's not the real history of these. It's only ever errors and aberrations. And believe me, there are a lot of them, right? Right. And so, and so there again, you know, my question is not so much, what should we do about Ukraine? My question is not so much, is Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite? I almost don't care. That's for me, well, of course I care, but for me, those are just different problems. I'm interested in how critical theory works. Critical theory I think critical theorists, again, are often proud that, that they don't necessarily reach dogmatic conclusions, and they want to do a kind of an open-ended analysis just to kind of bring us into a problem and understand its complexity. And I think this is precisely, and to do that very much through history, through historical memory, through memory politics. And yet I think this is very much what tends to go missing, right? When, again, collective self-reflection would diverge from the aims of the radical critique, from the aims of critical theorists. Now, I was going to add one other element of free speech, again, simply to say that a lot of our debates about free speech, which are really debates about hate speech, have been very much, you know, led from within critical theory. And again, many ways, I think in ways that are productive and important, particularly, I think, spurred by American critical race theorists and gender theorists and so forth. And what I would argue is that many of these people who identify as anti-Eurocentric, precisely because of this blindness about the left's own past, have given us very Eurocentric conceptions of hate speech and hatreds, right? What do I mean by that? Again, if we look into the past of, you know, the Soviet Union and other socialist regimes, particularly kind of you know, in their 20th century forms, what we find is there was massive use of speech, allied with campaigns that, you know, that devastated populations in the millions. Speech such as parasites, subversives, columnists. I mean, there was a whole vocabulary of political subversion which was used in campaigns that destroyed millions of lives, right, over a century. This was never considered to be hate speech. Because again, to consider it hate speech would have involved a very particular engagement with a leftist politics, which I think critical theorists have not been I don't see any evidence that they've been willing to do leftist memory politics. Again, there's never a denial. There's always a kind of tacit admission. Oh, yes, of course, we made mistakes, but no connecting of the dots. So we end up with a completely Eurocentric view of what hatred is, right? Hatred is the dominant forms it's taken in the West. And I think that's a really problematic position for critical theorists to be taking, right, to be imposing on the world, because the concept of hate speech, you know, if you look at the United Nations, this is a global concept now. And yet the whole world is expected to analyze it with respect to a very, very Western paradigm. And this, again, thanks largely to the critical theorists, I think that's a real problem. Again, I know that I've gone through those three examples very, very quickly, but I've gone over time now, and I really do want to hear from you. I was going to do one last slide about possible objections, but I'm not going to do that. I'd rather hear yours, but I can always go back to that, or I can go back to any other point. So I will now finish up, and I'll hand back to Jorge.
Thank you very much, Eric. What a pleasure. Thank you very much. And now we have Ian. Ian, are you there? Dr. Ian Turner from Lancashire, Central Lancashire. Ian?
Ian, you need to unmute, I think.
Let me stop the share.
Oh, yeah, that's
In
fine.
the meantime, I'm going
sorry.
to ask you something, Eric.
Yeah.
If you let me, we are recording this part, and Eric, am I okay to send this video to Chomsky?
I doubt that he'll look at it.
Okay, I'll send it then because I'm trying to get him for Juris North. I'm already in touch. I met him in 2019, so I'm definitely sending this to him.
Okay.
If you let me.
Yeah.
Perfect. Good. Thank you very much. Ian, your turn now.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jorge, for inviting me to reply to Eric, and also as well to Eric for his presentation. It was absolutely wonderful. In a sense, I'm sort of speechless, really. It was wow. It was really great. Apologies that I'm not looking straight at the screen. I've got two screens,
Okay.
and there was a delay in me actually switching my video on because I was struggling to find the button on a different screen. So I'm really sorry, but I mean, I would label myself as a critical legal theorist. I wouldn't pass myself off as an expert on critical legal theory. I'm sure there are people in the room who know much more about critical legal theory than me. But of course, initially, yeah, what has it been? As we all know, it's a very broad term for disciplines that we could say as critical legal studies, feminist perspectives. Even within feminist perspectives, obviously you got radical feminism, Catherine McKinnon. Then, of course, you bring in a counter sort of critique of radical feminism. You could maybe mention Kimberly Crenshaw, and you yourself, Eric, mentioned intersectionality as well. There's Marxist theories. You mentioned Marx as well, the Jewish question, the Goethe, Gramsci. What else? You mentioned critical queer studies, heteronormativity, normalism. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I got that right. But yeah, I'm thinking critical race theory. So I was thinking, before what does it actually mean? I'm thinking, oh yeah, we're going to be talking about critical legal studies. We're going to talk about feminist perspectives. We're going to talk intersectionality. We're going to talk about Marxist perspectives, critical race theory, critical queer studies, critical whiteness studies, critical crit theory, crit Latin, crit Asian, and I was sort of overwhelmed in terms of my knowledge and expanding my knowledge on critical legal theory. But of course, you did say at the bottom that there's right at the beginning there's so many areas, problems, discipline. Is it legitimate to generalize about critical race theory, because so many people disagree? So you weren't suggesting one thing, or that it was one thing, it was going to be one thing, it ought to be one thing. Just you were concentrating on problems, deficits that you felt that critical legal theory had missed. So yeah, that was really good. I really like that. So obviously you took it in more general terms. Of course, if you can actually talk in general terms within critical legal theory, and you're absolutely right that obviously militarism, colonialism, racism, you mentioned patriarchy as well. We can also talk about class subordination, domination, that obviously arises everywhere, but you're right to point out that primarily it's significantly Western in terms of the ideology that underpins it, and also historically as well, where it was most prevalent. So obviously the facets of the radical critique that you outlined, again, really insightful, really fascinating. It gave me some really much more food for thought than I was expecting. I wasn't necessarily expecting, and you did actually caveat that, I wasn't necessarily expecting counter-utilitarianism as necessarily, well, I can see how obviously critical legal theorists aren't necessarily Kantian, Rawlsian, Millian, and so on. And but at the same time, as a crit, I do tend to think. But then you did say yourself, didn't you? Because I always think about balance as well, numbers. So I think that's part of an element of critical legal theory. But I really liked what you said about the counter-utilitarianism. I'm actually writing a book at the moment on critical human rights, and very much done a lot of work recently on Locke and natural rights and the liberal tradition, and the hypocrisies, the contradictions within the liberal tradition, just as one example. Of course, Locke, being a shareholder in a slaving company, he drafted the constitutions of the Carolinas, permitting slavery. He also believed in legislative supremacy as well. He also talked about the exercise of the prerogative, which was outside and above the law. So the contradictions within liberalism, that liberalism itself holds itself off as being neutral. But of course, the idea is that the neutrality hides the discrimination, the marginalization, the disadvantage. So I think I was maybe thinking maybe there'll be a bit more in terms of, you mentioned counter-formalism, and obviously I really like the idea that you label it as counter-formalism rather than anti-formalism. And of course, within that, you talked about Marx on the Jewish question, on the Gotha program, class denomination, universality, things that I'm really interested in at the moment. But I was thinking maybe something might have been said more about critical legal theory and its evolution from American legal realism, and this idea about maybe the law not being neutral, but maybe that's an argument that we all as critical legal, or people interested in critical legal theory, accept. And we're obviously wanting to think further on about where the actual argument is going. I also wondered as well that I think you're right to identify the critical legal theory has a history within the left. I've also done quite a bit of work myself on Carl Schmitt and critical legal theory from the right. And I was wondering as well, potentially there could be something could be said about Schmitt and his critique of the liberal tradition in, for example, dictatorship, political theology, the concept of political, and so on. So in a sense, but yeah, I really liked where it was all going in terms of what I'm conscious of and what I'm trying to address in my book as well. That ultimately critical legal theorists are charged with the criticism that we're too critical, but we don't actually, we always seem to attack everybody else, throw bombs at everybody else, but don't actually present our own, I guess, less than maybe, I'm trying to think of some people who might have, but yeah, I think we're often critical, but we aren't actually, if there's such a word, as solutional. So what I really liked was, obviously, as you were moving to the end of your presentation in terms of Ukraine war, free speech, anti-Semitism, you're acknowledging almost the double standards within critical legal theory as well, that we as critical legal theorists very often emphasize the double standards within liberalism, natural rights, and so on, which are primarily, historically, if not present, the rights of white middle-class males and so on, to subordination of women, the working class, and so on. So we're very keen to critique, but obviously not necessarily in a position to offer solutions to problems. So that's where I could see where you were going in terms of the Ukraine war, anti-Semitism, free speech, is to almost take critical legal theories on at their own game. So to be honest, I don't actually have a lot of criticism, just to say that I really, really enjoyed it. It gave me so much food for thought. Obviously, you reference what I was expecting in terms of Marx and so on. You're right to obviously ignore other elements of critical legal theory because, of course, it's such a vast area and critical legal theorists disagree on obviously issues within that, even within sub-areas of critical legal theory, like I said, within feminism particularly. But just sorry, I'm not really in a position to take you to task on certain things, just the fact that I made notes and it was more a question that I was, really not overwhelmed in a good sense. And I didn't really have anything blindingly obvious to pick you up on. So just to say that I really, really enjoyed it, and thank you very much for the opportunity to well, I'm not even responding, but just to say that I'm just reinforcing what you're saying, and I loved it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I'm going to stop the recording now so we can enable questions and answers. Give me just a second.